Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The evening had arrived in the way that Sussex evenings sometimes do in late October. Not all at once, not with any particular ceremony, but gradually, the way sleep itself descends upon a tired mind. One moment, there was a pale gold light stretching across the downs, catching the last of the gorse in bloom, turning the distant sea to hammered copper. And then, quite without announcement, the fog came rolling in from the channel, soft and grey and absolute, muffling the sound of the water, erasing the horizon, wrapping the little town of Amberton-on-Sea in its cool, damp embrace. It was the kind of fog that belonged to this particular stretch of coastline, to these particular weeks of the year, to the turning point between summer's long retreat and winter's quiet arrival. Not an unpleasant fog, not a fearsome one. It carried with it the smell of salt and cold stone and something else. Something harder to name. The smell of distance, perhaps. Of time. I had been walking for most of the afternoon, following the cliff path from the eastern headland, where the old lighthouse stood dark and disused, down through the meadows above the town, past the church with its Norman tower and its leaning gravestones, past the rectory with its kitchen garden, past the row of terraced cottages, where the fishing families had lived for generations, and where now, mostly, the windows were dark or curtained against the autumn chill. The walk had been good. My boots were damp from the long grass. My coat smelled of sea air. My mind had gone pleasantly quiet in the way that only a long, solitary walk can produce, that comfortable emptiness, that gentle blankness, like a slate wiped clean. But now the fog had come, and the light had very nearly gone, and my feet had carried me, almost without my quite deciding to go there, down the narrow lane that curved away from the high street, past the old coaching inn with its creaking sign, past the post office that was also a lending library, and along the uneven pavement of what the locals called Mariner's Row, though no mariner had lived there for at least 2 generations, if they ever truly had. And there, at the far end of Mariner's Row, where the lane turned a slight corner before ending abruptly at a stone wall beyond which lay someone's walled garden, there it was, the shop. I had noticed it before, of course. One could hardly walk down Mariner's Row without noticing it, though I suspect that many people who walked down Mariner's Row did not notice it, or at least did not truly see it, in the way that we often fail to see the things that have always been there. It occupied the ground floor and a small mezzanine of a building that must once have been something else entirely. A sailmaker's workshop, perhaps, or a chandler's. Though whatever it had been before, it had been this for a very long time. The facade was painted a deep dark green, the paint old enough to have acquired a faint bloom, a softness, as if the colour itself had been mellowed by decades of sea air and soul spray. The window, which was bow-fronted and divided into small panes of old glass that distorted slightly what lay behind them, was lit from within by a warm amber light that had no particular source that I could identify. It was not the harsh white light of electricity, or not entirely. It was something softer, more diffuse, more like the light of oil lamps or candles, though perhaps that was only the effect of the glass. Above the door, on a board that had been painted and repainted and painted again until the wood itself seemed to have forgotten what it was, were the words Pelham and Sons, antiquities, curiosities, and articles of virtue established, 1847. And beneath that, in smaller letters that required a step closer to read, by appointment or by chance, I stood for a moment on the pavement outside, my breath making small clouds in the cold air, and looked at the window. Through the warped old glass, I could make out shapes, the curve of something porcelain, the dark spine of a book, the glint of something metallic, a suggestion of fabric in a deep red, the silhouette of what might have been a clock. The amber light moved slightly, as if stirred by a draught or by the movement of someone within, and a smell came through the gap beneath the door, a smell that I felt I had been seeking without knowing I was seeking it. Tea, old books, something woody, like cedar wood or sandalwood, the kind of smell that belongs to old drawers and old wardrobes, to the insides of trunks that have been closed for many years. And beneath all of that, faintly, the smell of the sea, which, of course, was everywhere in Amberton-on-Sea, in the walls, in the fabric, in the very stone. But here it was different. Here it was old, as if the salt had been absorbed not just into the building, but into the things inside it, the objects, the memories they carried. The sign on the door said open, in a hand that was careful and old-fashioned, the letters formed with a certain deliberateness, as if each one had been considered before being committed to the card. I pushed open the door. A small bell rang overhead, not an electric bell, not a buzzer, but a real bell, a little brass bell on a curved spring above the door, and it rang with a bright, clean note that seemed to travel all the way through the shop, and perhaps a little way beyond it, into whatever lay behind the green painted walls. I stepped inside, and the door swung closed behind me on its own, slowly, on a well-oiled hinge, and the fog was shut out, and the lane was shut out, and the evening was shut out, and I was inside. The first thing that struck me was the warmth, not excessive warmth, not the aggressive heat of a well-stoked Victorian parlour, though there was, as I soon discovered, a small cast-iron stove in the far corner, its grate aglow with the last of what must have been an afternoon fire. The coals dark now, but still radiating a gentle, even heat. No, the warmth was more than that. It was the warmth of a space that had been inhabited, gently and consistently, for a very long time, the warmth of accumulated presences, of the heat of 100 winter afternoons absorbed by the walls and the wooden floor and the objects themselves, stored and slowly released. The warmth of a room that had not been cold in living memory. The second thing was the smell, which was everything that the smell at the door had promised and more. The tea I could now identify precisely. It was brewing in a small pot on a trivet beside the stove. A dark, full-bodied tea, something with a touch of smoke to it, something from a tin that had probably been sitting on the same shelf for 20 years, replenished from the same source, so that the tea had become part of the smell of the place, rather than a visitor. And the books, there were a great many books, more than the space seemed capable of containing, shelves of them, from floor to ceiling on the left wall, and stacks of them on the floor, and piles of them on the broad wooden counter that ran along the right side of the shop. And the wood, yes, there was cedar wood, and something like it. And beneath everything, the faint, pervasive smell of old fabric and old leather and old things, things that had been handled and loved and set down and forgotten and found again, things that carried in their grain and their glaze and their binding the accumulated minutes of all the rooms they had ever been in, all the hands that had ever touched them, all the years. I stood just inside the door, taking it all in, not yet moving. The shop was not large, but it was arranged in such a way that it seemed larger than it was. Or rather, the arrangement gave the impression of inexhaustibility, as if no matter how many times one visited, there would always be something new to notice, some corner not yet explored, some object not yet examined. The shelves and surfaces and glass-fronted cases and open drawers and hanging things and stacked things created a kind of deliberate complexity, not chaos. Nothing here was random. Nothing had been thrown together without thought, but the sort of ordered profusion that one finds in the houses of people who have spent a lifetime acquiring things they love and who have arranged those things according to some principle that is entirely their own and makes perfect sense to them, though it might take a visitor some time to discern what that principle was. Along the left wall, the books occupied perhaps 2/3 of the vertical space, and the remaining third held objects that belonged or seemed to belong with the books, small framed prints, a magnifying glass on a stand, an ivory-handled letter opener, a pair of spectacles in a leather case, a small brass lamp with a green glass shade. The right wall was given over almost entirely to a series of glass-fronted cabinets, the kind with brass, fittings, and velvet-lined interiors, and in these were arranged smaller objects, jewelry and watches, and miniature portraits, and little boxes of various materials, and things I could not immediately identify from where I stood. Between the cabinets and the books, the floor space was occupied by a handful of larger pieces, a writing desk of dark wood with a slope-fronted lid, a small chest of drawer with painted panels, a hat-stand of extraordinary ugliness and character, a globe on a turned wooden stand. And at the far end of the room, beyond the stove and the kettle and the trivet and the brewing pot of tea, there was a counter, and behind the counter there was an old man. He was, I thought, somewhere between 70 and 80, though it was difficult to say exactly, because he had the kind of face that had probably looked old for many years and would look old for many more. Not decrepit, not frail, but settled, as if his features had long ago arrived at their final arrangement and were comfortable there. He had a great deal of white hair, combed with care, but of sufficient quantity that some of it was always escaping from wherever it had been placed, so that there was always a small cloud of it at his temples. He wore a suit of dark brown tweed that had been made for him at some point in the moderately distant past by someone who knew their work, and a waistcoat with small buttons, and a shirt with a collar that was perhaps one size too large for his neck, so that there was a gap there that gave him a slightly scholarly, somewhat rumpled look. He had glasses on a chain around his neck, but he was not wearing them, They rested on his chest as he looked up at me over the counter. "Good evening," he said. His voice was quiet, not a whisper, but the sort of voice that has no need to be loud, that carries easily in a still space, that has been speaking quietly for decades and has learned the economy of it. "Good evening," I said. "Folks come in," he said with a slight nod toward the door. "Yes," I said. "Quite thick now." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had expected. "It does that," he said. "This time of year. Sussex fog. Not like the London fog. Cleaner, colder. You can still smell the sea in it." "You can," I agreed. There was a pause, but it was not an uncomfortable pause. It was the sort of pause that a room like this seemed to require. A pause in which one was expected to simply be present for a moment, to look around, to breathe, to arrive. "Take your time," the old man said, and turned his attention back to something on the counter, a small object that he was examining with a magnifying glass that he now lifted from somewhere below the counter, his glasses still hanging unused at his chest. I took my time. I moved slowly to the left, toward the books. The first shelf I could reach easily held volumes of a decidedly miscellaneous character, the kind of shelf that accumulates over time without being curated, where things end up because they have nowhere else to go, but that are nonetheless kept because they have some quality worth preserving. There was a guide to the birds of southern England, published in 1894, with hand-coloured plates of extraordinary delicacy. The kingfisher rendered in a blue so vivid that it seemed almost to vibrate, the heron standing in its grey stillness, with a kind of dignity that the illustrator had clearly felt and tried to convey. There was a novel by an author whose name I did not recognize, published in the 1880s, with a title that suggested something improving and slightly melancholy. There was a collection of sermons in 2 volumes. There was a pamphlet on the cultivation of dahlias, its cover spotted with what might have been water or age. There was a travel book about a journey through Anatolia, made sometime in the 1870s, written in the confident, slightly incredulous voice of a Victorian traveller who found everything foreign deeply interesting and occasionally alarming. I pulled this last one from the shelf and opened it at random. The caravanserai at which we lodged for the night was a building of considerable age, its walls of dressed stone still standing firm, though the roof of the central court had long since given way to the sky. Our host, a man of perhaps 50 years whose hospitality was entirely genuine, and whose curiosity about our country and our customs was, I found, a mirror of my own regarding his, set before us a meal of flatbreads and olives, and a stew of lamb with dried fruits that I found, somewhat to my surprise, to be among the most nourishing and satisfying things I had eaten in many weeks of travel. I read this twice, standing in the warmth of the shop, and felt a small, pleasant movement in my chest, the movement that good travel writing produces, the sense of distance collapsed, of lives lived in other times and places, made suddenly present and real through the medium of careful, honest prose. I put the book back carefully, spine outward, and moved along the shelf. The next shelf held maps. Not modern maps, nothing printed on glossy paper with coloured contour lines and motorway designations. These were old maps, some framed under glass, some folded in their original folds, some rolled and tied with linen ribbon. I paused before a framed one that showed the coastline of Sussex as it had been surveyed and drawn in 1783. The coastline rather more ragged than it appears on modern maps. This was before the extensive work of the 19th century coastal engineers, before the sea walls and the groins and the regular dredging of the harbour approaches. The towns were marked with small engravings of their most notable buildings: the cathedral at Chichester, the castle at Arundel, the old pier at Brighton, which was then, of course, not yet Brighton, but Brighthelmston, the name not yet abbreviated to the familiarity that the Prince Regent's patronage would soon bring. And here, on the map, at the curve of the bay, the small notation that said, in the careful copper plate of the 18th century cartographer, Amberton-on-Sea, population 847, some trade in salted fish, 847 souls. A town at the edge of the sea, going about its business, mending its nets and salting its fish and building its small lives against the wind and the fog and the endlessly working water. I looked at that notation for a long time. "That map," said the old man's voice from across the shop, quiet and unhurried, came from the estate of a family called Hartley. They were landowners in this part of Sussex for about 200 years. The last of them, a woman called Edith Hartley, died in 1961. Never married, lived alone in the family house. It's a hotel now, up on the hill above the town. You may have seen it, with her books and her maps and her garden. When she died, her solicitor was charged with disposing of the contents. Most of it went to auction. Some of it came here. I turned to look at him. He had not moved from behind the counter. His magnifying glass was still in his hand, but he was looking at me over it. "How long has the shop been here?" I asked. "Since 1847, he said. "As the sign says. My great-great-grandfather opened it. He was a sailor, which is perhaps a strange beginning for an antique dealer. But he'd spent 20 years at sea and come home with things from everywhere he'd been, and he found he needed somewhere to keep them. And then he found that other people wanted to look at them, and some of them wanted to buy them, and so." He paused. "And so." "Pelham," I said, remembering the name on the sign. "Pelham," he said, and smiled, a small, pleased smile, the smile of a man who has had his name confirmed and found it satisfactory. "George Pelham now. My father was also George, which made things simpler in some ways and more complicated in others." I moved away from the maps, deeper into the shop. There was a section I discovered where the books gave way to a collection of scientific instruments, or rather, instruments that had once been scientific and were now historical. The distinction between those two categories being one of time and use, and the movement of knowledge. A brass theodolite in a fitted mahogany case, its lenses cloudy with age, but its mechanism, when I carefully tried it, still precise and smooth. A set of brass weights in a velvet-lined box, each one stamped with a lion and a crown and a number, accurate to fractions of a grain. A barometer in a case of dark wood, its face printed with the legend, "Fair, change." Rain in a circle around the dial, the needle currently pointing to the space between change and rain, which seemed, given the fog outside, entirely appropriate. And there, on a shelf of its own, elevated slightly above the others on a small wooden stand, was the telescope. It was a refractor, a proper Victorian refractor, the kind that had sat on drawing-room tables across England in the mid-19th century, the kind that gentlemen had pointed at the moon and at Jupiter, and at the moons of Jupiter, and had felt, perhaps, a particular thrill of the era, a sense of being connected to the great scientific project of understanding the universe. The tube was of brass, deep and warm, polished long ago, and now carrying the patina of decades of careful use and careful storage. The eyepiece was fitted with a rack and pinion focusing mechanism, its small knob worn smooth by the repeated small adjustments of whoever had used it most. A thumb and forefinger grip, worn into the metal like a memory. The objective lens at the far end of the tube was clear without the cloudiness that afflicted the theodolite's lenses, as if it had been better protected or better cared for, or perhaps simply lucky. The stand was a simple tripod of turned brass, its legs ending in rubber feet that had, over the years, hardened and cracked slightly but still served their purpose. Attached to the main tube was a smaller finder scope, a narrow secondary telescope that one would use first to locate an object before switching to the main eyepiece for magnification. The whole thing was perhaps 18 inches long when fully extended, and it sat on its stand with a kind of quiet authority, the authority of an instrument that has been genuinely used, that has done real work, that has served a real purpose, as opposed to the authority of an object acquired merely to ornament a shelf. I leaned close to look at the objective lens, not touching the instrument, but bringing my face near enough to see my own reflection distorted and miniaturized in the glass. "Pelham and Sons," said the old man's voice. I had not heard him move from behind the counter, and I turned to find him standing a few feet away, having approached with the quiet ease of someone entirely at home in the space. London, 1863. A good year for refractors. The optics are still sound. I had them checked 10 years ago when it came in. The previous owner had wrapped the objective in chamois and put it in its original case, which helped. "Who was the previous owner?" I asked. "A schoolmaster," he said. "A schoolmaster in Lewes, retired, who'd had it from his father, who'd been given it as a gift in 1870 or thereabouts. The father was a doctor, a general practitioner in Hailsham, who was also an amateur astronomer, which was not an uncommon combination in that period. The doctors tended to have both the income for a decent instrument and the inclination for systematic observation." He paused, looking at the telescope with an expression that was not quite fondness, but was something adjacent to it. "He kept notebooks," he said. "The doctor. Observation notebooks. Every clear night. What he saw, at what time, the conditions. I have 2 of them, somewhere." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the shop. "They're not for sale, but they're worth reading." "May I?" I asked, gesturing toward the telescope. "Of course," he said, and stepped back. I lifted the instrument from its stand. It was heavier than it looked, satisfyingly so, the brass solid in my hands, and raised it to my eye. Through the window, through the fog, there was almost nothing to see, only the amber glow of the lamp in the passage outside, and, beyond it, a dim suggestion of the lane. But the act of looking through it, the act of placing the cool brass ring of the eyepiece against my face and narrowing my vision to that small, circular, magnified world, had its own pleasure, entirely separate from what was visible. There was the quality of the glass itself, the way it Organized light, the slight, beautiful distortion at the edges of the field, the faint chromatic aberration that was not a flaw, but rather a signature of the technology of the period, the prismatic ghost of a color around bright edges. Someone had looked through this glass at Jupiter, at the rings of Saturn, at the double stars of Gemini, at the great diffuse cloud of the Andromeda Nebula, which they would not have known was a galaxy. Not yet. In 1863, that knowledge was still 50 years away. Someone had sat in a garden in Hailsham on clear autumn nights, had their coat collar turned up, their notes open on the garden table, and had brought the universe a little closer with this instrument. I set it back on its stand, carefully. "How much?" I asked. The old man smiled, the same small, pleased smile. "More than you want to spend on a foggy evening," he said. "But if you're still thinking about it in a week, come back. These things have a way of finding their people." I moved along the right wall, toward the glass cases. The first cabinet held pocket watches. There were perhaps 20 of them laid out on the velvet. Some open, their mechanisms visible. The tiny geared wheels and levers and springs of the escapement exposed like the interior of a clock, each one a small engine of time, others closed, their cases offering only the exterior, the decoration, the mark of the maker. The variety was considerable. Plain silver cases with engine-turned backs, gold cases with engraved flowers and classical figures, a hunter case of niello work, showing a hunting scene, dogs, horses, a mounted figure with his hand raised, a very plain gunmetal case that must have belonged to a working man, carried in a pocket alongside a knife and a handkerchief, its face scratched but its mechanism, presumably, still sound. I crouched to look more closely at the open ones, at their movements. A pocket watch movement of the mid-Victorian period is, to my mind, one of the most extraordinary things that human hands have ever made. Not because it is the most complex. Compared to a modern electronic device, it is crude. Compared to a modern precision instrument, it is imprecise. But as an object, as a made thing, it is remarkable. Every part of it was made by hand, or by simple machine tools operated by hand, by craftsmen who understood the mechanism deeply enough to make each part to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch. The balance wheel, spinning back and forth at perhaps 5 beats per second, regulated by the tiny coiled spring of the hairspring, maintained by the escapement's regular release of the mainspring's energy, the whole system dedicated to the single, obsessive purpose of counting out the seconds of a human life with as much accuracy as the materials and the skill of the maker could achieve. I had always found something deeply moving about pocket watches. I was finding it now in the warmth of the shop with the fog outside and the amber light within, crouching before the glass cabinet and looking at these small, stopped engines of time. "The one in the center," said the old man who had drifted to stand near me, "belonged to a solicitor in Brighton. His name is inside the case. I can show you if you like. He wound it every morning, apparently. There's a record of it. His daughter, in her diary, mentions it. Father wound his watch, after breakfast as always, and set off for the office. She wrote that on a Tuesday in March 1887. The watch stopped some years after his death. No one wound it after that. I looked at the watch in the center of the display. It was a plain silver hunter. its case polished to a high mirror finish, its face white enamel with Roman numerals in black, and a seconds subsidiary dial at the 6 o'clock position. The hands were set at 3:15, which is where they had been when the watch was last wound and the spring had finally run down, 3:15 on some forgotten afternoon. "Does it work?" I asked. "It works," he said. "I had it serviced. The movement is in excellent condition. Waltham, American, 1881. They made very good watches. If you wound it now, it would run. It would keep time." I thought about that. The watch stopping when no one remained to wind it. The watch starting again in a strange room, in someone else's hands. "What happened to the daughter?" I asked. "She died in 1943, he said. "She would have been 80 or so. She'd had a long life. She was a school teacher. She never married either, which was not so unusual for her generation. There were not enough men after the war. She left some books to a lending library and some furniture to a nephew, and her father's watch to no one in particular. It came here through several intermediate hands." I straightened up and moved to the next cabinet. This one held miniature portraits. The miniature portrait is an art form that flourished precisely between the invention of small mirrors and the invention of photography. That period, roughly the late 16th to the mid-19th century, when people wanted a portable image of someone they loved and had no technological means to produce one, except by the slow, skilled work of a painter with a very small brush. The subjects were mostly wealthy because the portraits cost money, and they were mostly of people who wanted to record their own appearance or give their image to someone who loved them. A wife giving her husband a portrait to take to sea, a mother giving her daughter a portrait to take to her new home, a young man presenting to his intended a small oval image of his own face, in the hope that she might keep it near. The miniatures in this cabinet were mostly encased in small oval frames of gold or gilded metal, some with a loop at the top for wearing on a ribbon, some in hinged cases like small lockets. The subjects looked out from their oval worlds with expressions that ranged from severe composure to the faintest ghost of a smile, dressed in the fashions of their various decades, the high-waisted simplicity of the Regency period, the elaborate collars and cravats of the 1840s, the slightly martial look of the earlier Georgian subjects. One in particular caught my eye. It was a woman, painted in the 1820s by the look of her dress and hairstyle, her dark hair arranged in ringlets, her expression neither severe nor smiling, but something between the two, a kind of alert attentiveness, as if she had been caught in the middle of listening to something and had looked up. The painting itself was exceptionally fine, the skin tone warm and alive, the eyes dark, well-defined, carrying an expression of intelligence, and, it seemed to me, a certain independence of spirit that the painter had captured without flattery or distortion. She was not conventionally beautiful, but she was vivid, and the painter had seen that and recorded it. "Who is she?" I asked, pointing to the portrait. The old man bent to look. "I don't know," he said, which surprised me a little. Most of the miniatures came with some documentation. A name at least, usually a date, sometimes a provenance. That one came without any of those things, which is unusual. She was found inside a writing desk that was purchased at an auction in Eastbourne in 1978. The desk itself turned out to be unremarkable. It had been repaired and modified too many times to be of much historical interest. But she was in the bottom drawer, inside a soft leather case, and no one seemed to know anything about her. She might have been in that drawer for 100 years, I said. She might, he said, or someone might have put her there the week before the auction. But I rather think not. The leather of the case was very dry and had contracted slightly. The portrait was compressed a little on one side. That takes time. And the drawer had a false bottom. Not a secret compartment exactly, just a drawer that had been shortened at some point to accommodate something else beneath it. And the space below had been used to store things that were meant to be kept safe. Paper and leather dry and compress differently at different rates. But the signs suggest at least 50 years in that drawer, perhaps much longer. I looked at the woman in the miniature for a long time. I'll think about her, I said. She's been waiting this long, said the old man. She can wait a little longer. Beyond the miniature portraits, the cabinet changed character, moving from the intimate and personal to the more formally decorative. Here were small boxes of various kinds, snuff boxes of gold and silver and tortoiseshell and papier-mâché, most of them with interior lids of mirror or engraved metal, card cases of silver, their surfaces elaborately engraved with foliage or pastoral scenes or geometric patterns, patch boxes, pill boxes, vinaigrettes. Each one was a small world unto itself, a container that had been made with care and that had spent its life in a pocket or a purse or on a dressing table, touched daily, opened regularly, a small, intimate companion to a human life. There was a snuff box that I particularly admired. Circular, silver, its lid engraved with a scene of great fineness, a man fishing by a river, trees behind him, a bridge in the distance, a duck on the water, all of it done with a skill that made the tiny figures and the landscape feel genuinely present, genuinely alive, rather than merely indicated. The interior was lined with a paper that had faded to a soft cream, and the hinge, when I asked the old man if I might pick it up and he assented, was perfectly smooth, opening and closing with a slight but definite resistance that told me the box had been well made and well maintained. Who made it? I asked. Matthew Linwood, he said. Birmingham, 1806. Linwood was one of the finest engravers working at that time in the Midlands. He was, by the records that survive, a small man with very large hands, which is perhaps why the engraving, when you look at it up close, has a slightly bold quality to the line, not timid or hesitant, even at this scale. How do you know he had large hands? A description in a letter, he said, a letter from a colleague, another silversmith, who visited his workshop in 1809. It's been published in a book about Birmingham metalworking, of no general interest whatsoever, but of considerable interest if you happen to be trying to understand this snuff box. He said this without any self-consciousness at all, as if the idea that one might read a book of considerable dullness in order to better understand a small silver box was entirely natural, which, in this shop, in this light, in this fog, it rather seemed to be. I had been circling the writing desk for some time, approaching and retreating, giving it sidelong attention while ostensibly looking at other things. in the way that one sometimes approaches an object that one particularly wants to examine, delaying the pleasure. It was a slope-fronted desk of the kind that was common from the mid-18th century through the Victorian period, a box essentially, with a sloping lid that could be used as a writing surface, with storage inside for paper and ink and correspondence, and with a mechanism below the main compartment for standing the desk at a useful angle. The wood was dark, walnut, I thought, or something that had been stained to resemble walnut, though I suspected the former. The surface of the lid had been covered with a tooled leather inset, dark green, worn to a kind of soft perfection at the area where the hand would rest naturally, a smooth oval of use in the center of the otherwise crisply worked surface. The desk was unlocked. The small brass lock had been fitted with a key, which was in the lock, which suggested that the old man was either very trusting or very confident in the goodwill of his customers. And I lifted the lid. Inside, the desk was fitted with a series of small compartments, of the kind that were standard for such pieces. A central deep compartment for paper, flanked by narrower sections for pens and a small bottle of ink. The ink had been removed, of course, but the ring of faint staining where the bottle had stood for perhaps 50 years was still clearly visible, with a row of pigeonholes above for correspondence. The compartment linings were of a faded blue paper, spotted here and there with a faint brown of age. But it was not the fitted interior that held my attention. It was the engraving on the inside of the lid. Someone, a previous owner, almost certainly, because the letters were not part of the original decoration of the desk, but had been added after the fact, perhaps with a penknife or a small engraving tool, had inscribed in letters of varying size and regularity that suggested both deliberateness and perhaps some emotion at the time of writing. E.M.H, Sussex, 1871. Still, the sea is here. 3 lines only. A name reduced to initials, a place and a year. And that last line, quiet and self-contained, with its small word still doing the complicated work of several meanings at once. The sea is still here. It is still present. It is unmoving in the way that things that have always been there are unmoving. Or it is the sea that stills the mind, the sea that is itself still, or the sea that remains when other things are gone. I traced the letters with the tip of my finger, not quite touching the wood. E.M.H, I said. We don't know who, the old man said. He was standing a few feet away, not crowding me, not pressing, but present. The desk came from a house clearance in the 1990s. A house in Seaford that had been in the same family for about 100 years and was finally sold after the last member of the family died without children. The contents were dispersed, most of them to auction. A friend of mine bought several pieces and passed this one on to me because he knew I'd like it. He paused. I've tried to trace E.M.H. The date is 1871. The location is Sussex. That's not a great deal to go on. There were a great many people with those initials in Sussex in 1871. But the line, I said, still, the sea is here. Yes, he said, that line. There was a silence. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, and the small bell above the door was still, and the coals in the stove had died down to a deep, dark red, and the amber light wavered slightly. Someone gave this desk to someone they loved, I said, or bought it for themselves to mark a beginning, or an ending? Yes, he said, and carried it from somewhere else to Sussex perhaps, or already lived here and needed to remind themselves. Yes, and the sea was the thing that stayed constant. That is what the line suggests, he said. I lowered the lid of the writing desk carefully, the hinge moving smoothly, and stood looking at it for a moment, the dark wood and the old lock and the key still in the lock, and tried to imagine E.M.H. in 1871, sitting at this desk in a room that smelled of sea air and perhaps coal smoke, writing letters, or attempting to write letters, or finding it impossible to write letters and instead marking the wood with the thing that was most true. The sea is here. Still, I moved to the books again, drawn back to them as I usually am. The section I had not yet examined was in the far corner, beyond the stove, on shelves that were slightly lower than the others, and that had a particular character. They were the shelves of a specific kind of collection, the kind accumulated by someone who reads late at night with a candle or a lamp, who reads not for information but for pleasure, who follows the movement of their own interest rather than any systematic plan. There were novels here and poetry, and what I can only describe as miscellany, things that did not fit elsewhere, books about botany and about cooking, and about the customs of rural England, and about the management of bees, and about the history of silk, and about the proper method of painting in watercolour, and about the natural theology of the Reverend William Paley, and about the novels of Mrs. Gaskell, and about the correct etiquette of a Victorian dinner party. Among these, I found, to my considerable delight, a small volume of poems by an author whose name I did not recognize, published in 1878 by a press in Hastings, hand-bound in a cover of dark blue cloth that had faded at the corners to a lighter, almost lavender tone. The title was Shore Poems, and the author was given only as A.W.P. I opened it at random, as one does with poetry, to see what the first line would give. The page I opened to held a poem called Night Tide, and the first line was, "The sea comes in without a sound. Tonight." I read the rest of the poem standing in the corner of the shop, my back to the stove, the warmth of the last of the coals on my left side, the amber light falling over my shoulder. The poem was short, 8 stanzas of 4 lines each, and it described precisely what its title promised: a night tide, watched from a height above the shore, the water coming in without drama or urgency, simply arriving, as it always did, covering the sand and the rock pools and the bright shells and the dark kelp, filling the harbour mouth, lifting the moored boats, and then, after a little time, withdrawing again, leaving everything as it was, or almost as it was, changed only in ways too small to see clearly, but that accumulated, tide by tide, year by year, into the significant changes that could be seen: the softened cliff face, the shifted shingle bank, the slow and certain recession of the land. It was a good poem. Not a great poem, perhaps, not one that would be remembered in anthologies. It had not been, since I'd never encountered it. But a good poem, honest and careful, doing what a poem should do, which is to say a thing that could not be said otherwise without losing something essential. I brought it to the counter. "A W.P.," I said. The old man looked at it and smiled. "A W.P.," he said. "Arthur William Pevensey. He was a schoolmaster in Hastings. He published 3 pamphlets of poetry between 1875 and 1882, and then, apparently, nothing more. I have all three. This is the second. Were they well received? There are no reviews, he said, which probably means no one reviewed them at all, which probably means they were published at his own expense and distributed to friends and perhaps to the local lending library. But he had a genuine gift. He turned the book over in his hands, then handed it back to me. The third pamphlet is better still, he said, but I'm not sure I want to sell it. What's it called? Evening and After, he said. Published in 1882. There's a poem in it about fog. Of course there is, I said. He smiled again, and this time the smile was wider, more open, and it changed his face considerably, smoothed the settled lines of it into something younger, something that might have been the face he wore when no one was watching. I bought the book of shore poems, and I bought a small ceramic tile that I found beside the stove, a Victorian encaustic tile of great beauty, deep blue and white, a geometric pattern of interlocking forms that might have been waves or leaves, or simply the pleasure of geometry for its own sake, glazed to a surface so smooth and cool that holding it was like holding a piece of winter water. And I bought, after some consideration and a conversation that lasted rather longer than I expected, and that covered, in its wandering way, the topics of Victorian science, the natural history of the Sussex Downs, the architecture of lighthouses, and the question of whether a life spent in one place is more or less rich than a life spent moving. I bought the snuff box with the fishing scene. These purchases, made at prices that were fair without being cheap, and that I paid without bargaining because that did not seem appropriate here, were wrapped by the old man in tissue paper and placed in a small brown paper bag, and the bag was tied with a length of brown string, and the whole thing was done with a quiet deliberateness that matched the character of the shop, as if even this small act of packaging was worth doing carefully, worth doing well. The old man poured me a cup of tea from the pot on the trivet. It was darker than I would usually take it, strong and slightly smoky, exactly right for the evening and the shop and the fog. And we stood for a while at the counter, not saying very much, comfortable in the silence in the way that people are when the conversation between them has gone somewhere real and does not need to be continually maintained. You'll come back, he said eventually, not as a question. Yes, I said. The telescope will still be here, he said, or it won't, but something else will be. I put on my coat and picked up my package and went to the door. The bell rang as I opened it, bright and clean, and the fog came in for a moment, cold, salt-smelling, real. And then I was outside, and the door had closed behind me on its smooth, unhurried hinge, and I was in the lane again, in the dark and the fog, with my brown paper package in my hand, and the smell of the shop still on my coat, and the amber light still visible through the bow-fronted window, warm and steady, as I walked slowly back up Mariners Row and into the fog. I came back on a Saturday in late November, when the fog had gone and been replaced by a cold, clear stillness of a very different character. The sky was pale and high, bleached of colour, and the light had the flat, even quality of winter light that makes everything distinct but nothing vivid. The sea was dark grey and very calm, its surface barely moving, and the chalk cliffs to the east were white against the grey sky with a sharpness that seemed almost painful. The shop was as I had left it. The sign said, "Open." The amber light was in the window. The bell rang as I opened the door. The old man was behind the counter as before. But this time, he was not examining something with a magnifying glass. He was reading. The book was a large one, its cover dark, and he had it open flat on the counter, his elbows on either side of it, his head bent slightly over it, in the classic posture of reading, the posture that has not changed in its essential form since there were books to read in. He looked up when I came in. "You came back," he said. "I came back," I said. "The telescope is still here," he said. "I know," I said. "I can see it." I could, in fact, see it on its shelf, the brass catching the amber light, the instrument standing on its tripod with its same quiet authority, its eyepiece aimed at nothing in particular, its objective lens ready for a night that might never come. But I did not go directly to the telescope. Instead, I spent some time, a comfortable time, a time without urgency, looking at the things in the shop that I had not examined on my first visit. There were always more things to find in a shop of this kind, always another drawer to open or another shelf to examine. And today I found, among other things, a collection of visiting cards in a small cardboard box, visiting cards being the Victorian equivalent of a business card, but used in a rather different way, left at houses when the caller found no one at home, or presented formally at the beginning of an encounter, each one a small advertisement for the person whose name and address it carried. The box held perhaps 100 of these cards, or more, accumulated over the years from various sources, and I sat down in the small armchair that the old man had placed near the stove. It was a very old armchair, its fabric faded and soft and slightly sunken in the seat, exactly the right amount of worn, and looked through them one by one. Reverend Thomas Blackwell, the Rectory, Steyning, Sussex, Mrs. Charlotte Allenby, 14 Marine Parade, Eastbourne Captain J.H. Forsyth, R.N., retired, The Lodge, Arundel, Miss Agnes Tremlett, Claremont House, Seaford, Sussex, Mr. Frederick, Harwood, Harwood and Partners, Solicitors, Lewis. Each card had once been in someone's pocket or purse, had been presented with a bow or a nod or a smile, had been received and placed on a hall table or in a drawer or in the visiting card case that every well-organized Victorian household kept for exactly this purpose, and had then made its way, by what series of steps it was impossible now to say, into this box, in this shop, in this fog-prone town on the edge of the Sussex Sea. I thought about Miss Agnes Tremlett of Claremont House, Seaford. I thought about what she might have been like, careful, probably, in her dress, in her manner, her visiting card presented with a precision that reflected her own sense of herself, or perhaps not careful at all. Perhaps she had been the kind of person who was always slightly late and slightly breathless, and whose visiting cards were always slightly bent from being carried too long in a pocket. I could not know. There was no way to know. There was only the card, cream-coloured, slightly foxed at one corner, the copper plate of her name and address still crisp after her 130 or 40 years, and the fact of her existence, the incontrovertible fact that she had lived, that she had had a house with a name, that she had called on people and been called upon, that she had existed in the bright, complicated fabric of Victorian social life as a specific and individual person. Still, the sea is here. I stayed in the shop for the better part of the afternoon. At some point, the old man made more tea. This time, he brought 2 cups to the counter and set mine on the edge where I could reach it, and we talked intermittently as the afternoon light faded and the amber of the lamp grew relatively more significant in the growing dark. We talked about many things. We talked about the visiting cards, and the old man told me about several of the people named on them. He had made it his practice, he said, to research at least some of the people whose objects came into his possession, because the objects made more sense with the people, and the people were more vivid with the objects, and both were more interesting together than either was alone. He told me about a woman called Lucy Farrington, whose cut-glass inkwell had come to the shop with a letter, folded inside it, which was how they had identified it, that she had written but apparently never sent, addressed to a man in London, explaining in careful, unhurried language why she had decided not to accept his proposal of marriage. The reasons she gave were practical and clear and entirely sensible, and reading between the lines of them, or not even between the lines, really, but in the lines themselves, in the steadiness of the hand and the precision of the argument, it was possible to see a woman who had made a decision about the shape of her life that had cost her something, but that she had made honestly, without self-deception, and that she had written down for herself as much as for him, perhaps to be sure of it, perhaps to make it real. He told me about a man called William Greer, whose boot scraper, a handsome cast-iron thing in the form of a crouching fox found at a house sale in Alfriston, had turned out, after some research, to have been made by an ironmonger in Lewes, who was William Greer's maternal uncle, and who had given the scraper to his nephew as a wedding gift in 1887, and whose ironmongery business had continued under his son and then his son until 1963, when it had been converted into a chemist's shop. He told me about the painted chest of drawers, the one with the painted panels, and here his voice changed slightly, took on a quality of increased care, as if the story required more attention. The chest came from a house in Rottingdean, he said, a house that has since been demolished. The painted panels, there are 4 of them, one on each drawer front, are scenes from a garden. Not a specific garden, I don't think, but a general garden, the kind of garden that exists in the imagination as much as in reality. A walled garden with roses and peonies and a sundial and a wooden seat, and a figure in 2 of the panels, a woman seen from behind, bending to smell a flower or standing with her hand resting on the back of the wooden seat, her face turned away. The woman in the paintings is always with her back to us. We never see her face, and the paintings are very good. Not the work of a professional artist, but not amateurish either. Someone painted these who knew what they were doing and who felt something very strongly about whatever or whoever they were painting. I think the woman is someone specific. I think someone painted her from memory or from imagination after memory had blurred, keeping her turned away because to paint her face would have been to make it definite, to fix it, and they didn't want to do that or couldn't do it. And I think the garden is a real garden, or was, a place they both knew, and that was important to them, that they needed to preserve somehow. But I can't prove any of that. I'm not going to try to sell it to anyone who doesn't feel it too. He stopped speaking. The amber light burned steadily. Outside, the clear November sky had gone fully dark, and through the bow window I could see the first stars, very bright, very cold, the kind of stars you see in late November when the air is completely clear, distant and precise. I feel it, I said. He looked at me, and something in his expression was satisfied, but not surprised. The expression of a man who has been right about things for a long time and has learned to trust his own judgment, including his judgment of people. I did buy the telescope in the end. Not that day. I did not have the money for it that day, or not the comfortable money, the money one can spend without counting. I came back a third time, in January, when the year was new and the sea was very cold and the town had the particular quality of winter in a coastal town, the quality of endurance, of hunkering down, of waiting. The shop was warmer than usual that day, the stove well stoked against a frost that had settled over the downs and the town and the cliff paths and the beach. The old man saw me come in and saw me look immediately at the shelf where the telescope stood, and he said nothing, only watched as I crossed to it and lifted it from its stand once more and turned it in my hands. I had been thinking about it in the weeks between my second visit and this third one, in the way that one thinks about a purchase that is at the borderline between sensible and indulgent, turning the decision over and over, finding reasons for and reasons against, knowing all along, or almost all along, what the answer would be. The schoolmaster's notebooks, I said. The observation notebooks. Yes, he said. May I see them before I decide? He brought them from the back, from somewhere beyond the counter that I had not yet seen. They were two small books, octavo size, their covers of a dark red cloth that had faded to a dusty rose at the corners and edges. The pages were ruled in pale blue, and the writing on them was very small and very neat, the writing of a man accustomed to writing small in a small space, recording much information efficiently. The first entries were from 1872, January 4th. Clear, moon, gibbous, waning, rising late. Observe Jupiter, 4 moons visible, Ganymede to the east, the others in close grouping, seeing moderate. 2 hours, January 10th. Fog all evening, no observations. January 15th, clear after 10 o'clock. Some drift, observed Saturn. Rings in fine condition. Cassini division clearly visible. Titan visible. Remarkable steadiness for January. 3 hours 20 minutes. Page after page of this. The nights catalogued with a patience and a persistence that I found deeply moving. The clear nights celebrated in the noting of detail. The magnification used, the quality of the seeing, the objects observed. The foggy nights or the cloudy nights acknowledged with brief, stoical notes. Overcast, no observations, or fog from afternoon, no observations, or simply rain, and occasionally, among the astronomical records, a personal note, brief and without elaboration. March 8th, 1873. H. unwell, no observations. June 4th, 1873. H. much better. Warm evening, some cloud. Attempted observations, clouds persistent. Brief glimpse of Mars, nothing definite. December 24th, 1873. Clear and cold, family gathered. H. in good spirits. Orion rising, The belt at 8 o'clock. Could not stay long. 30 minutes. Ch. The person in the doctor's life who, when unwell, could prevent even the clear nights from being properly observed. The person whose good spirits warranted a note in the margin of an astronomical record. I read through most of the first notebook standing at the counter, and the old man did not hurry me, and eventually I closed it and put both notebooks down and looked at the telescope again, standing on his shelf. "How much?" I asked. He told me. I paid. On my fourth visit, it was March now, and the first warmth was beginning to come into the air, and the gorse was in flower again on the downs above the town, the yellow very bright against a sky that was doing its best to be blue. I went to look at the porcelain. I had noticed the porcelain on my first visit without really attending to it, because there had been so much else. It occupied one of the glass cabinets near the middle of the right wall, and it consisted of perhaps a dozen pieces, cups and saucers and a small covered pot and 2 plates and a cream jug and a sugar bowl, of a type that I eventually identified, with the old man's help, as Swansea porcelain, made at the Cambrian pottery in the first decades of the 19th century. The particular quality of Swansea porcelain that distinguishes it from the work of other English potteries of the period is the flower painting. The flowers are painted with a delicacy that borders on the translucent, the petals layered and modelled in the glazing with a skill that makes them appear at a certain angle, almost as if they have a real depth, as if one could push a finger through the surface and touch something that is not quite flat. The flowers on the pieces in the cabinet were primarily roses, pink and cream, with occasional blue morning glories and yellow-scented white daisies, all set against the white ground of the porcelain with an ease and assurance that came from long practice. "Who painted these?" I asked. "Not one person," the old man said. "A team of painters. The painting at Swansea was done by a small group of specialist flower painters, most of them trained by a man called Thomas Pardo, who had worked at Derby before coming to Swansea. Pardo trained his painters carefully, and they developed a characteristic style. You can see it in the way the roses are built up, the layering of the petals, the way the shading is done." He opened the cabinet and handed me one of the cups, a small teacup, perfectly proportioned, light in the hand. On its outer surface, a rose in full bloom, the petals finely rendered, surrounded by 2 buds and a scattering of small leaves. The handle had a slight S-curve that fitted naturally to the fingers. "They would have painted a great many cups like this," he said, "day after day, in the painting room, at a table with a light from a north window. You needed steady, even light, not direct sunlight, which moves and casts shadows that change the colors. Each painter had their subjects, one for roses, one for other flowers, one perhaps for the borders and the gilding. Working quickly, they would have done many dozens of pieces in a day. And yet," he paused, "and yet each one is individual. No 2 are identical. The brushwork is never mechanical. There's always something in the execution that is the painter's own. Some small decision made at the moment of putting brush to porcelain that is irreducibly personal." I held the cup up to the light. The porcelain was translucent. If you looked through the base of the cup against the amber glow of the lamp, You could see the shadow of the rose painting on the outer surface, visible through the body of the cup as a darker shape, a ghost of itself. The set was assembled gradually, he said, not bought all at once. The cups and saucers match perfectly, but the cream jug is from a different period, and the covered pot is from a different production run. Someone added to it over time, finding matching or near matching pieces, which tells you something about the person. They were careful, they cared about the set, they wanted it to be complete, and they were patient about completing it. I thought about that person. I thought about them in a kitchen or a parlor, checking a new cup against the existing pieces, holding them up side by side against the light to see if the color of the ground matched, if the style of the rose matched, if the cup would sit comfortably among the others without looking out of place. The care of that. Do you think it was a man or a woman? I asked. He considered this without any impatience at the question. A woman, he said. I think. The care of it, the gradual completion of the set, the matching of pieces over time, feels like the care of someone who used this for real purposes, who wanted the tea table to be right, who valued the beauty of the thing as part of the pleasure of using it. Men certainly collected porcelain, of course, but this set, the way it was assembled, the evidence of use, the small repairs to two of the saucers, this feels like a woman's object. I bought one of the saucers, only one, not the whole set, which was meant to stay together, but one saucer that had been separated from its matching cup at some earlier point, and that the old man said had no pair, and was therefore, in some sense, already outside the set. I would look at the flower on it in the morning, he said, in the north light, and I would see it differently than I saw it now, in the amber of the lamp. He was right about that. I looked at it the next morning, in the north light of the kitchen window, and the rose on the saucer was different, cooler, more precise, the shadow under the petals more definite, the color of the pink less warm and more true. It was a beautiful thing in either light, but it was two slightly different beautiful things, depending on the light, which seemed right for something made in 1820. I did not come back to the shop until May, when the hawthorn was in bloom on the hedgerows above the town, and the days were long enough to walk the cliff path after dinner and still be home before dark. I came back because I had been thinking about the journals, the doctor's observation notebooks, yes, but also the other journals that the old man had mentioned in passing on various visits that the shop contained. A shop like this inevitably accumulates journals and diaries. People keep them throughout their lives and then die, and the journals are dispersed. Because they are the records of private rather than public lives, they often find their way not to archives or libraries, but to auction houses and house clearances, and from there to places like this. The old man told me, when I asked him directly about this, that he had perhaps 40 or 50 journals in the shop at that time, of various periods and from various parts of Sussex, and that he was genuinely uncertain what to do with all of them. They should be in an archive, he said, ideally, but county archives are underfunded and overwhelmed, and most private journals are not considered significant enough for the archive's collections unless the person who kept them was notable in some way. So they sit here, and I read them sometimes, and sometimes I sell them to people who will read them, and sometimes I don't. Do you have a favorite? I asked. He thought about this seriously. Outside, a gull was crying, and the sound came through the half-open door that he had propped open for the first time since I'd been coming to the shop. The first May warmth letting the sea air in. There is one, he said. A journal kept by a woman called Harriet Beaumont, who lived in Lewes from 1858 to 1922. She kept a journal continuously from 1876, when she was 18, until a year before her death. Not every day. Sometimes there are gaps of weeks, even months, but more or less consistently for 45 years. And she was. He paused, looking for the word. She was honest, he said. Remarkable in her honesty. She wrote about her marriage without sentimentality, about her children with real clarity, about her own limitations and failures with a candor that is quite unusual for any period, let alone the Victorian period. And she wrote about Sussex, about the town, the seasons, the downs, the people she knew, with the kind of precision that comes from a lifetime of careful observation. How many volumes? I asked. 31, he said. You have all of them. 19 of them, he said. The others are gone somewhere. These came from the attic of a house in Lewes that had been in the family until the early 1990s. The people who inherited the house didn't know the journals existed. They'd been in a trunk under some furniture for decades. They sold the lot. May I read one? I asked. He went to the back of the shop, the mysterious back, which I had still not seen, which I had come to think of as the true interior of the place, the part of it that was not for sale or for show, and came back with a volume. It was bound in dark leather, its cover cracked but intact, the pages slightly swollen at the edges, as pages will swell in a damp climate over time. He set it on the counter between us. I opened it. October 14th, 1888. The Michaelmas term has begun, and R is back at school, and the house is both quieter and somehow larger without him, though he is not a large child and not a particularly noisy one. It is rather as if his presence fills the rooms in ways that have nothing to do with his actual dimensions. G notices it too, but will not say so. He is proud, and to admit that the house feels empty when one's son is at school would be to admit a weakness that he cannot afford. I do not criticize him for this. He was educated himself to need no one, and the need has grown in him without his permission, and he does not know quite what to do with it. I am fond of him. This afternoon I walked up to the castle, not for any reason but that it was a good afternoon and I wanted the view. The air was very clear. I could see, I thought, almost to the channel, or at least to the low hills above Lewes that stand between the town and the sea. The sheep on the down were moving very slowly eastward. The way sheep move when there is nothing hurrying them, the small white dots of them against the brown of the down. I thought about nothing in particular, which is a rare pleasure, and one I have learned to cultivate. The mind, left to its own devices on a clear afternoon, is better company than I usually give it credit for. This evening, candles lit after dinner, G at his papers, the children in bed, the fire burning. I am at this moment entirely content, which I record because contentment is not always easy to notice while it is happening. I read several more pages. The the journal was full of entries of this quality, small, careful, precise in their observation without being fussy, warm without being sentimental, alive to the texture of daily life without making too much of it. The entry about the October afternoon on the castle hill stayed with me particularly. The image of the sheep moving slowly eastward, the view to the sea, the mind left to its own devices. I thought about Harriet Beaumont, who had lived in Lewes for 64 years and had recorded 45 of them in 31 volumes of careful, honest prose, and who had died in 1922, and whose journals had been in a trunk in an attic for decades, and who was here now in this warm shop on a May afternoon, as present as anything. Let me tell you about an evening I spent in the shop when I had no intention of buying anything and no particular purpose beyond being there. It was in September, more than a year after my first visit. I had been to the shop perhaps a dozen times in the intervening months, always finding something new, always spending longer than I had intended, always leaving with some small addition to the life of the objects around me at home, and with the particular satisfaction that comes from a place where one is genuinely welcome and where the things for sale are genuinely worth looking at. This September evening was a Thursday, and I arrived at the shop at around 5 o'clock, which was later than usual for the dahi. Time of year, the evenings were shortening, and it was already beginning to be dark, the sky to the west fading through orange to a deep rose and then to grey as I came down Mariner's Row. The shop was lit as always, the amber light warm in the bow window, the bell bright as I opened the door. The old man was not alone. There was a young woman at the counter, not young perhaps. She might have been 35 or 40, talking to him about something in a low, earnest voice. She had a notebook in her hand and a pen behind her ear, and she turned when I came in with the polite, assessing glance of someone who is used to being interrupted and has learned to deal with it graciously. "Do come in," said the old man. "We were just discussing the chest." The chest he referred to was one I had not examined closely. It stood against the back wall, half hidden by the escritoire and a tall hat stand, and I had noted it on previous visits without making it the subject of any particular attention. It was a sea chest by the look of it, long and low, constructed of a dark, dense wood, teak, I later learned, or the equivalent, with iron fittings, its lid arched slightly, its surface showing the marks of considerable use and considerable age. "A sea chest," I said. "A sea chest," he confirmed. "Built around 1820, I think. It came to me from an estate in Bexhill, a family that had been in the merchant service for 3 generations. This particular chest seems to have belonged to the eldest son of the first generation, who went to sea in 1835 and came home in 1869. The woman, who introduced herself as a researcher from the University of Sussex, studying material culture and the merchant marine, was interested in the chest for her own reasons, and the 3 of us looked at it together. The exterior was largely plain, as sea chests tended to be. No point in elaborate ornamentation on an object that would spend its life being bumped around below decks. But the interior was a different matter. The inside of the lid had been painted, by the owner himself, one assumed, with a scene that was both simple and, in the context, deeply affecting. A coastline, seen from the sea, the chalk cliffs of southern England. They could not be anything else. White and distinct against a blue sky, the sea in the foreground a painted green-grey, and above the cliffs a town or a village, tiny and remote and perfectly clear, every small building suggested with a few sure brushstrokes. It was, unmistakably, the view of Amberton-on-Sea from the water. The tower of the church was there, the line of the High Street, the smaller cluster of Mariners' Row, the old lighthouse on the eastern headland, which had been operational in 1835, its light still visible, and beyond the town, the smooth line of the downs, and above the downs the sky. He painted this inside his chest, I said, so that every time he opened it, he could see home. Yes, said the old man. He opened it every day, said the researcher. A chest like this was his wardrobe and his storage. Everything he owned was in it. He would have opened it every morning and every evening. Every morning, I said, he would have seen this. For 34 years, she said. We stood looking at the painting in the inside of the lid of the sea chest for a long time without speaking. That evening, the old man closed the shop at 6 o'clock, or rather, he turned the card in the door from open to closed. But he did not seem in any hurry to lock up, and the researcher stayed, and I stayed, and we sat, the researcher and I in the 2 armchairs that had been arranged near the stove, and the old man on a stool behind the counter. And the old man made tea, a new pot, and brought it over on a small tray with 3 cups and a plate of biscuits, of the kind that come in a tin and have the particular virtue of being exactly right for this sort of occasion. The shop had a different quality in the evening, when it was closed. The amber light seemed brighter, more concentrated, the darkness outside more complete, the interior more entirely its own world. The objects on the shelves and in the cabinets and on the surfaces seemed to settle, or to breathe differently, as if relieved of the obligation to be looked at by strangers. We talked about the sea chest and the man who had painted the view of home in its lid. The researcher had a good deal of information about the family. She had been researching them for some months, and she told us about the eldest son, whose name was James Pelham Carruthers. Not related, the old man confirmed, to his own Pelhams, though the coincidence of the name pleased him, who had gone to sea at the age of 14 as a cabin boy on a merchant vessel trading between Southampton and Lisbon, and who had risen through the ranks over the following years to become, by his mid-30s, the master of a small but profitable vessel trading in the eastern Mediterranean. He had come home to Amberton-on-Sea in 1869, as the old man had said, at the age of 52. He had found the town changed in the ways that a town changes over 30 years, some buildings gone, new ones in their place. The harbour improved and expanded. The railway arrived in 1853. The old families thinned, and the new ones arrived to fill the gaps. He had found his parents dead, his siblings scattered, his childhood home sold and converted. He had found the shop on Mariners' Row. Not this shop? I asked. This shop, said the old man. It was my great-great-grandfather who bought it from him. The chest came with the shop as part of the transaction. And here it has been ever since. He sold his chest, said the researcher. He had nowhere to put it, said the old man. He had no house. He sold the chest and the contents and a few other things he'd carried home from his last voyage, and with the money he rented a room above the coaching inn, and he lived there until he died in 1882. He never left Amberton-on-Sea again. The researcher wrote something in her notebook. I watched the coals in the stove, which had been built up for the evening and were now burning with an even, steady heat. The painting in the chest, I said. He had the view of the town in his chest for 34 years, and then he came back and he sold the chest. Yes, said the old man, and then every morning after that, when he woke up in his room above the coaching inn, he could look out the window and see the real thing. Presumably, said the old man. It must have been strange, I said, not having the painting anymore. Or maybe not. Maybe when you have the real thing, you don't need the painting. Or maybe, said the researcher, looking up from her notebook, the painting was the thing he needed when he was far away, and when he was home, the painting was just a painting. We thought about this for a while. The shop was very quiet. The stove burned steadily. The tea was good. The hand-painted porcelain tiles behind the stove. I had been noticing them for months without quite attending to them, the way one can fail to see what is most consistently present. There were 4 of them, set into the wall in a 2-by-2 arrangement, each one showing a different plant: a passion flower, a clematis, an iris, and a rose. They were very fine, clearly Victorian, probably arts and crafts in their sensibility. The colours, terracotta and blue and cream and sage green, warm and handmade looking. Each leaf and petal slightly individual, slightly uneven in the way that hand-painted things are uneven. Those tiles, I said, on one of my autumn visits, my second autumn of visiting the shop, which meant I'd been coming for more than a year. The tiles behind the stove. Those aren't for sale, said the old man. I know, I said. I didn't think they were. They're part of the shop. They were part of my grandmother's kitchen, he said. She had them installed in 1923. When she died and the kitchen was renovated, I took them out and brought them here. They've been behind that stove since 1978. She had good taste, I said. She had extraordinary taste, he said, and very little money. The combination produces a particular kind of discriminating attention. You can't buy everything you admire, so you learn to look very carefully at what you do buy, to make sure it's worth the having. In October, I came on a weekday afternoon and found the shop empty of other customers, as it often was. The shop did not seem to do a brisk trade in the commercial sense, and I had begun to wonder, as one does about places of this kind, how it sustained itself. And the old man was doing something at the writing desk with a bottle of linseed oil and a soft cloth, working the oil into the wood of the slope very slowly, with small circular movements. I stood and watched him for a while without interrupting. The movement was very slow and very even, and it had the quality of a repeated action done with full attention. Not mechanical, not going through the motions, but present in each small circle of the cloth, feeling the wood, responding to it. The smell of the linseed oil was warm and specific, exactly right for the autumn afternoon, and the old wood and the amber light. I do this every year, he said, without looking up. All the wooden pieces, October usually. The oil keeps the wood from drying out in the winter, when the stove makes the air very dry. You do all of them? I said, thinking of the number of wooden objects in the shop. It takes most of the month, he said, but I like it. I sat down in one of the armchairs and watched him work, and we talked and fell silent and talked again, in the easy way that had become natural between us over the course of many visits, and the afternoon passed very agreeably without either of us being anywhere except exactly where we were. He told me that afternoon about his father. The father, the other George Pelham, had run the shop from 1953, when the old man's grandfather had died, until 1981, when he had handed it over to the old man and retired to a cottage in Alfriston, where he had lived until his death in 1999. The father had been, by all accounts, a different character from the son, more expansive, more gregarious, more interested in the business of buying and selling than in the objects themselves. He had been good at the auctions, which required a particular kind of competitive temperament and a quick eye and a willingness to act on instinct, and he had brought a great deal of important material into the shop that the quieter, more reflective old man would never have acquired, because he would have stood at the back of the auction room thinking about it for too long, and someone else would have bid. He had a gift for it, the old man said, for recognizing things quickly, for knowing in 30 seconds whether something was good. I've never had that. I need time. I need to hold something and think about it, which means I miss things sometimes, but it also means that the things I do buy, I've thought about properly. Is that better or worse? I asked. It's different, he said. The shop is different from when my father ran it. Less busy, probably, more selective. Whether that's better or worse depends on what you think the shop is for. What do you think it's for? I asked. He stopped his work with the cloth and looked at the writing desk for a moment, then looked at me. I think it's for looking at, he said, for being with, for the kind of attention that objects deserve and that we usually don't give them because we're too busy and the light is too bright and there are too many things competing for our notice. A shop like this kind of shop, the very particular kind, slows things down. It makes a space where you can look at one thing for a long time. And if you look at one thing for a long time, you start to see not just the thing itself, but the time that made it, and the hands that made it, and the lives that used it. And that is, I think, valuable. Not commercially valuable, necessarily, but valuable. He went back to his work with the cloth. I thought about what he had said for a long time afterward, on the walk home, in the clear autumn evening, with the stars coming out over the sea. December came, and with it the full darkness of the short days, and the cold that settled over the downs and the town and the sea, and the particular quality of December light, low and raking and golden when it came, which was not often, the clouds massing from the southwest and bringing rain most days, but occasionally, on the clear afternoons between the storms, coming in at a horizontal angle from the south that illuminated things, the chalk of the cliffs, the wet surface of the lane, the stone walls of the old houses, with a warmth that belied the cold of the air. I came to the shop on the last Saturday before Christmas, not to buy anything, though as usual I left with something, a small watercolour of the view from the eastern headland, the old lighthouse in the foreground, the town in the middle distance, the channel beyond, painted by someone whose initials were W.A.T. and whose work had a directness and a simplicity that I found more satisfying than more accomplished work would have been. But to bring a small gift for the old man, a tin of the same tea that he brewed in the shop, which I had tracked down after some effort, to a supplier in London who still sold it by the £1/4, loose, in a plain tin. He received it with evident pleasure, setting it on the shelf beside the stove where its predecessor sat, nearly empty. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to," I said. "The tea has been a considerable part of the pleasure of these visits." "It was my father's tea," he said. He found the supplier in the 1960s. I've used them ever since. He made a pot immediately, and we sat with it in the warmth of the shop while the December rain came against the window, and outside on Mariners Row there was no one, and the town was settling into its Christmas quietness, and the amber light burned as it always did. I had brought also the observation notebooks of the doctor from Hailsham, the ones that had come with the telescope, the ones I had read at the counter on the day I had first decided to buy it. I had read them many times since, and had wanted, this December, to return them, not because they were not mine to keep. They were, I had bought them with the telescope, but because they felt as if they belonged here, in this shop, in this light, near the telescope that the doctor had looked through for all those winter nights in Hailsham, noting Jupiter and Saturn and the double stars of Gemini in his small, neat hand. "I thought these should come back," I said, setting them on the counter. The old man looked at them without touching them for a moment. "You've read them?" he asked. "Many times," I said. "Did you find out who H was?" he asked. "His wife," I said. "Her name was Helen. She died in 1881. Influenza. After that, the notebooks become more frequent, not less. He spent more nights at the telescope after she died than before." The old man was quiet for a moment. "The notebooks stay here," he said. "Thank you." He placed them on the shelf behind the counter, between two taller volumes, where they sat with a kind of rightness, a sense of being in the correct place. We drank our tea and listened to the rain and the occasional gull, and the afternoon passed into evening, and the shop was warm and still. "Will you be here next year?" I asked, eventually. Not because I had any reason to think he would not be, but because the question felt important to ask. "As long as I can manage it," he said. "After that, my nephew knows the inventory reasonably well. He's not the same kind of person that I am, but he has good instincts. The shop will continue." "It has to," I said. "Yes," he said. "I think it does. Now, if you have been listening, if you have been in the shop with me these past hours, walking the aisles, opening the cabinets, reading the miniature portraits and the observation notebooks and the shore poems, you will understand, I think, what I mean when I say that a place like this is not about the buying and selling. It is about the attention. It is about the practice of looking at things slowly, of holding them and feeling their weight and their texture and their temperature, of considering what they are made of and who made them and why and for whom, of asking what years they have been through and what hands have touched them and what rooms they have occupied and what light has fallen on them. and of understanding that in doing this, in spending this time and this attention, one is doing something that is not merely pleasant, but is in some way necessary. Necessary for the soul, if you will permit the word, or for the part of the mind that requires contact with made things, with the evidence of human labor and human care and the human time. The telescope through which the doctor of Hailsham watched Jupiter and Saturn on clear winter nights in the 1870s, while his wife H was in the house behind him, the light in the parlour window warm and steady, the writing desk of E.M.H, with its inscription, "Still, the sea is here," the miniature portrait of the unknown woman with the alert, intelligent face and the dark ringlets, who looked up from whatever she was attending to when the painter asked her to sit still for a little while, the snuff-box with its fishing scene, the line of the river and the trees and the distant bridge, all worked in silver by a man with large hands in Birmingham in 1806. The sea chest with its painted coastline, the view of home that sustained 34 years of sea voyages and was then left behind when the real thing was finally permanently available. The Swansea porcelain saucer with its rose, painted on a January morning in Swansea in the 1820s by a woman, or perhaps a man, but I think a woman, with a very fine brush and a steady hand and a feeling for the quality of light through the petals. The visiting card of Miss Agnes Tremlett of Claremont House, Seaford, slightly foxed at one corner. The journals of Harriet Beaumont, 31 volumes covering 45 years of a life in Lewes, honest and clear and warm and written for no one and for everyone. These things are in the world. They are in a shop on Mariners Row in Amberton-on-Sea, in the warmth of a cast-iron stove and the amber light of a lamp that has burned there for as long as anyone can remember, in a fog that comes off the channel and wraps the town in its cool, clean silence. They are waiting. They are patient. They have been patient for a very long time, and they will be patient a little longer, until the right person comes through the door and the bell rings, bright and clean, and the door swings shut on its well-oiled hinge, and the warmth of the shop comes forward to meet them. Let us sit here for a little while longer. The stove is warm. The tea is still hot. Outside, the fog is thick and still, and the lane is empty, and the town is quiet. The coals have gone from red to dark, but the warmth remains, the warmth of an afternoon fire in an old room, the slow release of stored heat. The telescope stands on its shelf. The brass catches the amber light. The miniature portrait of the unknown woman, the woman with the alert face and the dark ringlets, who looked up from whatever she was attending to when the painter asked her to sit, looks out from her oval frame with the same expression she has worn since 1825 or so. The expression of someone in the middle of listening to something important and finding it, on reflection, rather interesting. The writing desk stands near the window. Inside its lid, in letters carved perhaps with a penknife, perhaps with more care than that, E.M.H/Sussex, 1871/Still, the sea is here. The books are on their shelves. The maps are folded in their cases or framed under glass. The visiting cards are in their box. The porcelain is in its cabinet, the rose on each piece painted in the clear winter light of a window facing north. The shop is very quiet. The old man, if he is there, and he is always there, or seems to be whenever one arrives, is reading or examining something with his magnifying glass, or polishing a piece of wood with the slow, circular attention that it deserves. If you came in now, the bell would ring, and he would look up, and he would say, "Good evening," in his quiet voice that carries easily in the still air, and he would leave you to look. You could spend hours here. You could spend an afternoon, an evening, a succession of evenings over the course of a year, and you would always find something you had not noticed before. Some drawer not yet opened, some shelf not yet examined, some object not yet held in both hands and turned to the light. The fog is outside. The warmth is here. Take your time. A breath in, a breath out. The sound of the coals settling in the stove, a small bright click of contraction. The smell of the tea and the books and the sea. You are here. You are safe. Everything is as it should be. The lights are dim and warm and steady. The shop is quiet. The fog is outside. And the sea, still, patient, infinite, is here. There is one more thing I want to tell you about. Some months after I had first found the writing desk, the walnut slope-fronted desk with the green tooled leather inset and the inscription in the lid, the old man called me. He had my telephone number because I had given it to him, suggesting that if anything came in that he thought might interest me, he should call. He rarely did, and when he did, it was always for a good reason. "The writing desk," he said when I answered. "I found something." I went to the shop the following afternoon, a winter afternoon, cold and clear, the kind of day that gave a long blue light over the downs. The something he had found was a letter. Not a letter that had been in the desk when it arrived. He was certain of that, because he had examined the desk carefully when it came to him, but a letter that had been in a secondary compartment, a very small space between the interior fitting and the base of the outer case, a space so narrow that it would not be found by anyone who was not looking for it, who did not run their fingers along the inner walls of the case, feeling for the slight irregularity that would indicate a gap. "I was doing the linseed oil treatment," he said. "October. I do all the wooden pieces. And I felt something. Here." The letter was written on paper that had become fragile with age. Carefully, fragile, the way old things become. The fibers of the paper still holding together, but no longer with any confidence. It was written in a hand that was very clear and neat, the hand of someone who had been carefully taught and who cared about their letters. The salutation was, "My dear," and there the letter stopped. Half a line, 2 words, and a dash, and then nothing. The rest of the page was blank. "My dear." We looked at it for a long time. "E.M.H, I said. "Presumably," he said. "They started a letter," I said, "and couldn't finish it. Or decided not to. Or didn't know how." "Yes," he said, "all of those things." The letter was dated October 15th, 1871, the same year as the inscription in the lid. E.M.H, Sussex, 1871. Still, the sea is here, and in October 1871, in a room somewhere in Sussex with a view of the sea, someone had opened a writing desk and begun a letter that they could not finish. "My dear," and then had closed the desk and gone, presumably, to look at the sea, which was still there, which is still there, which has been there since before anyone came to look at it, and will be there after everyone has stopped looking, patient and immense, and entirely indifferent to the questions we bring to its edge. Still, the sea is here. The letter is in the shop now. The old man framed it, very simply, in a narrow, dark frame with a white mount, and it hangs behind the counter, near the observation notebooks, near the photograph of his grandfather that has always been there. It hangs between other things, other objects, other records of lives and moments, and the things people did when they could not do anything else, when all they could do was write something down or carve something in wood or paint a view of home in the inside of a chest or watch the stars on clear winter nights in the garden in Hailsham, noting everything they saw. My dear, the amber light falls on it in the evenings, when the fog is outside and the stove is warm and the shop is quiet. The hand is clear and precise. The two words and the dash are everything and nothing, the beginning of something that was or was not finished in some other form, in some other place, in the actual conversation or the actual action of which this letter was the unfinished preparation. We cannot know. We have two words and a dash and a date and the inscription in the lid of a desk and the vast patience of the sea. It is enough. It is somehow more than enough. So now, dear listener, if you have been with me through all of this, through the fog and the amber light and the brass telescope and the Swansea porcelain and the observation notebooks and the shore poems and the sea chest and the visiting cards and the 31 journals of Harriet Beaumont and the letter with two words and a dash, then you have been in the shop. You have been warm and still and attended to. And if your eyes are heavy now, if the warmth of the stove has done its work, and the long day is finally, mercifully letting you go, then let it. Let the fog be outside and the warmth be here. Let the objects sleep on their shelves, patient and full of their long histories, waiting for the next person who needs them. Let the sea be there, beyond the town, beyond the cliff path, beyond the old lighthouse on the headland, steady and vast and ancient, and entirely unchanged by any of our small, particular, precious concerns. Let the bell above the door be still. Let the fire in the stove go quietly dark. Let the amber light burn low. You are safe here. Everything is as it should be. Good night.